Hi everyone, my name is Alex, and this work is from my PhD that I just finished, which is funded by the CFP and loads of institutions that were involved in my PhD as well. But my PhD investigated the chemical susceptibility of trees to grey squirrel bark stripping damage. So grey squirrels probably don't need much of an introduction to this audience, but I'll do it anyways. So grey squirrels were named the #1 threat to broadleaf woodland health and creation by the Royal Forestry Society, and that's above other threats such as deer damage and introduced diseases. So it's a well-known issue amongst the forestry community. It damages our trees, the health of our trees, and also our timber supply as well. A report published a few years ago estimated the costs of squirrel damage to Britain and estimated that to be about £37 million a year. And actually, the cumulative cost of this is going to be about £1.1 billion in the next 40 years, which is a lot of money. And currently, the only way that we can manage squirrels is by shooting and trapping them. So lethal control, which has different levels of effectiveness depending on how you apply it. And the problem with this is that we don't know why squirrels bark strip. So because we don't know why they do the behavior, it becomes really difficult to manage it. But we do know a lot about the trees that are susceptible to bark stripping, such as oak, beech, and sycamore. But we don't really understand the underlying causes for that susceptibility. So again, that becomes quite difficult to manage because we don't know why some trees are more susceptible over others. And my PhD mainly looks at the chemistry of these trees and how that might influence the decisions of squirrels to bark strip. And we've never looked at that before, so we don't really know how these defensive chemicals within trees might be playing a role in the behavior. But we do know that these chemicals have influenced squirrel herbivory before and does help squirrels make decisions on what to eat and the palatability of their food. Non-grey squirrel species, but other squirrel species across the globe. So my PhD looked at the potential role of volatile organic compounds. And these are defensive chemicals that the trees produce, and they're usually byproducts of other primary processes within the tree, but these are gaseous compounds that plants produce. So they're things that you would smell in plants, and they're things that the squirrels are going to smell from the plants. And we know that these specific compounds have influenced squirrel herbivory before, and we think that this could be indicating the palatability of the bark to the squirrels. So they're associating this smell with a particular taste in the tree. And currently, rodent pest management is heavily reliant on rodenticides, not squirrel control, but other rodent species. And a lot of the research now is trying to move away from that, and has cited these types of compounds as being quite a good solution in terms of ethics and the environment as well. So the aim of my project was to test the potential for deploying these natural defences, these volatile organic compounds, of trees to manage the bark stripping damage by grey squirrels in Great Britain. And I achieved this aim through two objectives, and the first being looking at these compounds within the trees and seeing how they differ with susceptibility. And then the second objective, we took some of those compounds that we identified from the trees, and then we tested them in the field with squirrels to see how they responded to these compounds. So for this first objective, one of my colleagues, Charles Dutton, he had a site that he managed, and he said, oh, there's something weird happening here. And it was a provenance trial. So all of these trees on this site are the same genus, but they're hybrids between different species. And some of them get damaged quite a lot, and there's one hybrid in particular that doesn't get damaged. So he was thinking there's something interesting happening here, and there's something in this tree that the squirrels don't like for whatever reason. So the picture on the left there is a picture of one of our susceptible hybrids, and you can see at the tops the squirrels have caused a lot of damage to the canopy of these trees, and in heavy wind a lot of these tops are broken off. So a lot of those trees looked a bit dwarfed and deformed. And then the picture in the middle is a picture of our resistant hybrid, which is standing quite tall and proud and virtually has no damage. And then there's a map there on the right of just where our site was in the landscape. It was on a farm. So I went to this site collected data on the damage, but I also went back and sampled some of the foliage from these trees, and then placed the foliage in a gas chamber so that we could collect the compounds that were being produced by these trees. And then we use gas chromatography mass spectrometry to then analyze these compounds and actually identify what compounds are in each of our tree species. So that was objective 1. And then objective 2, once we identified those compounds, we then tested them in the field of squirrels. So we exposed wild squirrels to these compounds that we found in our resistant trees, and then we recorded their behavioral responses relative to a control, and then we compared their responses to compounds that we identified from our susceptible trees. So we had 3 compounds from our resistant trees that we tested, and then we had 3 compounds from our susceptible trees that we tested. And what we did is we had squirrel hoppers with lids, so squirrels had to learn how to open the lid, and then we had a small vial in the hoppers with a solution of the compound. So when the squirrels opened the lid, they got a waft of that compound, and then we had a camera on the opposite tree where we measured their behavioral responses. So mainly we were looking for how long they spent at the hoppers, how long they spent feeding, and how long they spent with the lids open. So what we found was that for that first objective, when we were looking at the chemical composition of these trees, we observed massive differences in the types of compounds that we found in our susceptible trees and the types of compounds that we found in our resistant trees. And this composition correlated with tree susceptibility. And so it suggested that these compounds could be influencing the behavior. And then in the second objective, we observed negative behavioral responses to the compounds that we identified from our resistant trees. So squirrels spent less time with the lids open, less time feeding, and less time at the feeders. And then we observed positive behavioral responses to the compounds that we identified from our susceptible trees. So they spent more time feeding, more time with the lid open, and more time at the feeders. So we think from this that tree chemistry does mediate squirrel behavior. But what does this actually mean in terms of practice? How can we use these results? In the short term, we could potentially use some of our resistant compounds as chemical sprays or paints on trees, but that would be quite expensive and quite labor intensive, so that's probably more applicable to applying these compounds to individual trees if we want to protect individual trees. And it would be similar to applying tricho. But yeah, that would probably take quite a lot of effort to do. But in the longer term, what we really want to do is identify the genes that are responsible for these chemical traits, and then use gene editing methods to breed trees that are resistant to squirrel damage. And then hopefully we can have trees that are able to evade squirrel damage. So there are some challenges with this. It is a really complex wildlife management challenge, and we still have conflicting management objectives between landowners, and that's quite a problem, especially with squirrel control. And we do need some more research to translate these findings into practice. But one thing that I didn't do in my PhD was understand why squirrels bark strips, so that still remains a really big problem and could provide us with more options for management as well. So in terms of future work, we are starting to look at chemicals within the bark, so things that squirrels would be tasting, and that's probably more of what resists or defends the tree against bark damage. So that's work that we're doing currently. And also, we are building tracking collars for squirrels with multiple devices, but the objective of that is to collect data on squirrel behavior and hopefully figure out why they're bark stripping. But yeah, thanks so much, and thanks to all my supervisors and everyone who helped me in my project.